and moved to the southeast. Spent the next 40 years in the southeast area of the United States. Mostly in Alabama, but some in North Carolina too. But I had an engineering company there that we did engineering all over the southeast, and we serviced municipalities like many the size of Camp Point, Quincy. Some of the big ones was the city of Atlanta, and Asheville, North Carolina. And I finally retired in about 95. I wanted to keep busy, so I bought 18 acres of land and built and subdivided it and built 18 spec houses on it. And I got tired of that after just a few years. So anyway, at that point, I left North Carolina and moved back to Camp Point. About the time my mother passed away, I moved back here. So I've been here 20 years. So the first 20 years of my life, I was here. The last 20 years of my life, I'm here. And in between, it was 40. So I've been putting information together about my grandpa Huber for quite a few years now. And I figured by the time I had 80 years old, I better get it presented and put together, because I won't have too much longer. So,
Turn the lights on?
Yeah.
anyway, that is a picture of the subject tonight, Lambert Huber. He was born in Germany. He immigrated to the United States when he was about 20 years old. He was born in 1858, immigrated about 1879, 78, 79, something like that. He first settled in, well, he didn't really settle, but he stopped in Coatesburg and did some farming, and that didn't last very long. He moved to Camp Point, and he went to work for probably the biggest construction company at the time. The name of it was Liggett and Batchy, and he just went to work for them. But his education included, back in Germany, he was a cabinet maker and a carpenter. So that's what he was when he came here at the age of 20. So he was, he died in 1945. I remember him. And he was an active Mason and active in the Methodist Church here. He taught Sunday school for quite a few years, taught the men's class primarily. So let me go on. He's come from a fairly large family in Germany, about 8 or 9. Well, let me go to another slide here. That is kind of his family. That's him and his wife. He married Christina Decker. She was from Coatesburg, or in the Coatesburg area, probably a farm. And it looks like they're out of focus quite a bit. There's the way I'm looking at it. But anyway, this is my dad right here. And this is me. I have one son, Marcus, who lives in Alabama. I have a sister, Shirley Louise, better known to most of you as Shirley Perry. And she had 3 children. One of them was named James Edward, and he's better known as Jim Perry. And I think he's sitting there. Charles Huber. Many of these died young. There was one stillborn, one died of diphtheria. 2 of them, let's see, yeah, 2 of them died of diphtheria when they were real young. And fever. Couldn't remember. But anyway, there was only 3 of them that lived to old age. My dad had a sister. She married a guy by the name of Fred Baldwin. Had one son, Rick Baldwin, who was an educator in Quincy. I think he was a principal over one of the grade schools. And he had 2 adopted children. In 1982, as part of my business, the wastewater treatment plant in Asheville, North Carolina was needing a major expansion, one in the neighborhood of $30–40 million. And we were their engineers. And at that time, in 1982, I didn't know a whole lot about our family. And I knew nothing about family in Germany. So, as part of our project in Asheville, North Carolina, we got EPA grants to the tune of 75%. And they made an offer of, well, it was part of the law that if you use some kind of innovative technology in the building of the treatment plant, you got a 10% grant bonus on top of it. So that would have been substantial. So I took one of my employees and the manager of the Metropolitan Sewer District in Asheville on a trip to Germany to look at wastewater treatment plants, sewage plants, wastewater, whatever you want to call it. I had 3 photos of German family. I knew that come from Germany and nobody else recognized. My dad said those were from Germany. So I took them with me because I didn't know where we were going exactly. But anyway, we flew into Amsterdam, took a train to Paris and looked at sewage treatment plants around Paris and on the English Channel. Then we flew to Munich, Germany, and visited several wastewater treatment plants there, and one in Salzburg, Austria. And we had round trip reservations on the plane to return from Amsterdam. So we rented a car, and we had 2 days to kill. So, and we were in Munich. So I said, let's drive back through the Black Forest. See if I can bump into anybody named Huber over there. So we took off from Munich. We got into the Black Forest Mountains and stopped at a restaurant, get a bite to eat, and there's a phone booth in the restaurant. And I went to the phone booth and I opened the phone book to see if there was a Huber in there, and there was only about 4 or 5 pages full of them. So I thought, well, I can kiss this idea. So we just headed on through the Black Forest, and on the back of that photo, which is the size of a postcard, it said, it had the name of a photographer who put it together and a town by the name of Ottenhofen. And we were cruising. Ottenhofen doesn't show up on a road map. But we come across the mountain, and all of a sudden here was a sign, we were just entering Ottenhofen. I said, hold the show here. We pulled into the nearest restaurant. Ordered some food, and there was a young waitress there that was serving us, and I showed her that picture, and she didn't know anybody, but she wanted to know if she could take it. There was an old lady Oh, probably 80. She was older than me in 1982. Sitting back in the corner eating a bowl of soup or something, and the girl wanted to know if she could take it back and show it to her. She took it back there, and I looked at her while the lady was looking at those pictures, and she was talking, she was naming everybody on that picture. So she couldn't speak English at all. So they got on the phone, the restaurant did, and called a lady that was born in England, so she could speak English and German. She married a German. She come up and then was our interpreter. And she said, this guy named Wilhelm Huber. He lives a half a block down the street here. And if you want to go down and see him, I said, well, sure, yeah. So we walked down there and knock on the door, and there was nobody but his wife there. He was out on a job somewhere. So that's how I got introduced. But 2 or 3 hours later, he comes home. And before the day was over, I had met him. He owns a construction company. He employs 200 to 300 people, and they build buildings of all kinds, build churches, houses, wastewater treatment plants. Of course, he had to take me out to see a wastewater treatment plant that he built, because he found out what I was doing there. And then a few hours later, I showed him a picture that I had, and he said, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. And I said, well, where was Grandpa Huber born around here? He said, yeah, he was born in Seebach. And that's about 4 miles up the road. And his brother, his younger brother, lives there, lives in the farmhouse. So that's how I got introduced to Germany. You know, I've been back and forth about 7 times for different reasons, and some of them have been to visit me here. Back in Wilhelm has the one that owns the construction company. He's been over here a couple of times. He's deceased now. I went to his, in the early part of 2000, I went to his 80th birthday party and 50th wedding anniversary. They had a party for both of them. Anyway, before the evening was over, we were at the farmhouse. And this young guy, right here, Theodore, he lived in the farmhouse and had raised his family there. So the family, the farmhouse where Lambert Huber was born was in the family at that time, and still is. Theodore's since passed on. Wilhelm's passed on. They've all passed on. The one up there, I forget his name now, but he was killed in World War II. Maybe fighting us. So, this is a map of Western Europe, and this is about where Seebach is. And it's very close to Strasbourg, France. And the Rhine River goes between them up through here. So how Lambert got here was he goes down to the Rhine River, gets on a barge, and he goes north up through Mannheim, Wiesbaden, on up, and catches a ship up there in the Netherlands. comes to the United States, he comes into New Orleans and caught a barge, some sort of barge traffic, got on it, come up the river and got off somewhere, I assume between Hannibal and Quincy or one of the two. That's kind of a panoramic view of the Black Forest, an aerial panorama. And I've highlighted where Seebach is in the whole thing. So I had come from the east going to the west towards France when I drove into the area where Seebach is. That is the house, the way it looked back in the 1800s, and I assume it looked about that way when Lambert lived there. And it's a typical Black Forest farmhouse. And the upper story, there's a road that's about the elevation of the upper story that runs back behind it, and half of this upper story is hayloft. So you can drive a load of hay up here, put it in the hayloft, and the other half is living quarters, like bedrooms. And this level was all living quarters, and down here is where they keep the cows on the lower level. And there's a chute about that big around that comes from the hayloft down through the living quarters to the cows. It's an enclosed chute, so you're not spreading hay all over the place. So it's just like a big tube. And whether it was there in the 1800s, I have no idea, but it's there now. And they still use it that way. I've got some current pictures of it. Well, that is a map of Seebach, and it's on the order of Camp Point, I guess, or Coatesburg, maybe. The little dots are houses, and that's where the Huber farm is. That's what it looks like today. Can you see that, Errol?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Well, that's been added on, and at the time I was there, it was occupied by one of the sons who got married, but the family still lived there. Theodore and his wife's name is Wahlberger. Interesting name. Okay, that was taken when I went over there for his 80th birthday. But that is Wilhelm Huber that owned the construction company, and one of the young boys in the picture. And that is Theodore, the brother that lived on the farm. And this is one of the sisters and her husband. This is Theodore and his wife, and Wilhelm and his wife, Catherine, and of course me. And that's part of the family. It's got Wilhelm and Theodore and Wahlberger, and the rest of them are their kids and grandkids and that kind of thing. That little building that I said belonged to a son and his family is, my wife and I went there in 2011, and we visited the place, and they turned that into a schnapps house. They have a contract, I guess they have a permit of some kind with Germany that they can produce and sell so many liters of schnapps per year. And it's made of various kinds of fruit. And they do have fruit trees on the farm. So, at that particular time, 2011, none of the people in the previous pictures were living. So this is one of the sons. This is a son-in-law, and this is me and Eileen and a friend of the family. That's the still. You know, it produces pretty good stuff if you can stand it. Kind of like white lightning, with a slight fruity flavor to it. Okay, we're back to Camp Point. That's on York Street, and my grandfather built that house in 1912. My dad was 12 years old at the time, and the house next door is where they lived prior to that. But he had this property, and that house has since been torn down, and this one looks like it's fallen down now. It's that blue house on York Street that's pretty deteriorated on the outside. However, I went in it in 2005 for the bicentennial, and the interior and the woodwork all looked good. So it's recoverable if somebody wanted to buy it. Well, about the time they built that house, this is what was left of the family. That Harold, that's my dad. This is the little girl, Verna, later Verna Baldwin, and Clifford and Charles. Charles died young he was about 32 years old, and he had 2 children, and the wife remarried. Children were real young, and moved to California, and his children have both deceased now, but back in the 80s, and I made trips out and I've seen all of them. And that's just a toss-in picture there. Some dealer, I guess, had a car come out and wanted to demonstrate it. The guy in the white smock behind the wheel is a demonstrator, I guess, and the whole family's in there. And I think that picture is in the 1955 Book of Families. That is the last known picture of Lambert. And this is me, and I would judge from that picture I was probably 4 years old, maybe. So it's a 1944 photo, and it's a family reunion, the DeWitt Huber family. And this is Lambert Huber right here at the time. He died about a year later. And this is Grandma Huber. This is my sister, Shirley Perry. My other stepsister, Marge Cockshell. My other sister, Carolyn. And if anybody knows him, that's Kenny Leapley there. And his brother Eddie. Okay, in 2005, that's what's left of the old Liggett lumber yard. And it's gone now, been replaced with a fireman's exercise place. And this sign was in front of it that says it was purchased by Lambert Huber in 1888. And then it became Huber Brothers and Liggett Builders in 1896. And that was before Lambert had bought another building. But at some point in time in the 1890s, the Liggett and Huber parted company, and the Liggett went to the lumberyard business. My grandpa stayed in the building business. And for a short time with his brother, probably 4 years or so, a brother from Germany came over and was in business with him. And the brother married a lady from Quincy in 1891, and they were in Camp Point for a while, but they eventually parted company with my grandfather, and he moved to Quincy. His name was Matthew Huber. So all the Hubers, or most of the Hubers you hear of around the Quincy area, are descendants of Matthew Huber. He had quite a large family. I think he had 9 children in just a few years in Quincy. So that was probably in sometime in the 1890s. Lambert Huber bought this building right here. It used to be a Camp Point Manufacturing Company building. But most of the upstairs in this was full of woodworking equipment. They made all fancy wood trim and for staircases and that type of thing.
Where was it?
It's on Fremont Street. If you know where Mike Turnier's buildings are, that's where it was. That picture and that information is in this 1899 souvenir book from Camp Point. I don't know why it was originally put together, but it has a lot in there about the different businesses and houses and things in Camp Point. So this kind of tells about it.
Is that book in the library?
I'm sure there's a copy of it here.
There's some copies here.
I might add that the original copies were deteriorating quite a bit, and we had one that was falling apart. Well, Mabel Stabler had a pretty good copy of it, and she redid it and put this cover on it as it was kind of a project for one of the Sunday school classes at the Christian church. I forget, I think it says on there. Friendship Circle or something like that. I forget, but anyway, it's got her name on it, Mabel Gay Stabler. And I assume there's a copy of it in here somewhere. If there's not, we probably ought to get one. Well, that's just a picture of it. That is a partial Camp Point map in the Adams County Atlas. I think it was 1870 something, which showed the Wabash Railroad coming through and CB&Q, which is still there. And where I have, right in this area where I have my cursor, is where Lambert Huber's shop was. which is where Mike Turnier is now. And this also shows where, which we'll talk a little bit about later, where the Christian church was at that time that burned down in 1912. Well, that was in the Adams County Atlas of 1872, and that is it's not really a photograph, it's more of an artist's rendering, but that is the same building that Grandpa Huber bought and made his carpenter shop. But this was Kent Point Manufacturing Company, and it's set on that spot, you know, too, where his building was. And they made farm equipment. Well, I don't see any automobiles running around. Yeah. Okay, let's get to the round barn. That picture comes from this book, Episodes of a Farm Boy, and that was written by Carl Lewis. Carl Lewis is a son of Charles Lewis, who had the barn built. Another son, or Carl's brother, would be Dana Lewis, who is the father of George Lewis, the famous attorney in Quincy. He gets everybody out of trouble. But anyway, there's a section in this book that tells about the building of the barn. And Lambert had a lot of discussions with Charles Lewis about the building of the barn. And there's not many round barns anywhere near. But there was two, I think, two or three that the Agriculture Department of the University of Illinois in Urbana had built. And so they went over there and looked at them. And they pretty much based the design on those, but just made them quite a lot larger. And turned them into more than a hay barn. And so I'm sure many of you have been to the round barn. It's in up at the fairgrounds now. And that just tells a little bit about it. It's built in 1914. That's a newspaper article in 1984. That's the year that they got the round barn listed on the National Historic Register. So it belonged to Dana Lewis at the time, I believe, which is a brother to Carl and the father of George. Okay, that's just a photograph of the way it looks today. And you notice that the cupola got rebuilt. Let's see, I think it was missing. Yeah, this picture in 1984 that was in the paper, the cupola up there was gone. It had rotted away or something. but the people that did the moving, they rebuilt that cupola and put it back up there. And that information and several pages of information about how but most of the lumber that went into the building of the barn, they cut off of the land that was where the barn sits. And they started a couple of years before the building started, so they had the boards cut and everything and laid out to dry for a year or so to get ready. But anyway, except for shingles and a few other things, the wood comes off the farm, off the trees. Okay. That, I call that the Kate House, mainly because when I was growing up, it belonged to George Kate. And I mowed his grass some and delivered his newspaper. And I'm showing it up front because that is another structure that Lambert built that's listed on the National Historic Register. And it was designed, it had a professional architect. Name was Ernest Wood out of Quincy. And Ernest Wood was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. And he utilized one of Frank Lloyd Wright's standard designs, in which Frank Lloyd Wright called the Prairie Schoolhouse or something like that. Prairie House, just the way it's shaped. Now, I did look up some information about Ernest Wood, the architect on that. He's from Quincy, and he did the architectural work on many of the historic houses and buildings in Quincy. Well, that is just a listing that spells out a few details about it, but I don't know exactly what the date of that is, but it was for sale at the time and it was listed by Bauer, so that was written up by Shirley Bauer. All right. So anyway, we've been through the three structures that's listed on the National Historic Register: the round barn, the Kate House, and what else was it? I forgot. No, I did. That's it. Just two. Okay. I'll be okay. Christian Church was dedicated in February of 1913. Previous church building, I call it church. The church is the people, but the church building is before this was on Jefferson Street, where the Masonic Hall sits. And it burned in January of 1912. So in 12 months, from the time that burned until this was dedicated and attended, is kind of unbelievable to me. That back in those days, when you didn't have much but horses and a few Model Ts, that you could build something like that in 12 months, but they did it. Cost $28,000. That's the way it looked back in, well, maybe 1920, something like that. But it looked like that for years until they put an addition on the one end out towards the alley. And there is a history. The church has written history of it. If you're interested in it, I'm sure they'll show it to you. While we're on churches, this church building was built in 1907, and that is, anybody recognize it?
Liberty Church.
Liberty Lutheran Church. It was on that site, there was a church building there that burned down, and they contracted with Lambert Huber. Probably had a design architect somewhere, not sure, to build it. So the way it looks today is pretty much the way it looked when Lambert Huber finished building it in 1907. Oh, let's go back to the Camp Point Christian Church. I had never heard that there was an architect involved, but I knew there almost had to be.
Yeah.
So I was talking to Fred Bessel about it, and said there must be a set of plans or drawings or some information in the church that would tell us this. So within a couple of days, he walks in with a roll of drawings. That is a copy, that's a blueprint copy of the original drawings for the Christian church in Camp Point. And the architect was a guy by the name of Martin Geisy from the famous Geisy family in Quincy that for a long time was a Buick dealer. And he's fairly famous too. He built a number of the old business buildings in downtown Quincy, plus many of the houses. And he has an exhibit in Quincy Historical Building, which is, well, years ago it was a public library, and I think they call it the Gardner Museum now. But he has a special corner in there that talks about his work, so happen to be interested. Okay, let's get out of churches here. Okay, the Masonic building was originally called Fraternity Hall or Fraternity Temple, one of the two. And there was two organizations involved in this, the Masons and the Knights of Pythias, two separate organizations. My grandfather was a member of the Masons, and my dad was a member of the Knights of Pythias, if that means anything. You'll have to Google Knights of Pythias and find out all about them. But that was erected in 1916 at a cost of $13,500. It has a cornerstone on the northeast corner and the northwest corner. And I can't remember which is which, but on one of the corners it's the Benjamin Lodge of the Masons, and it has the building committee the building committee was made up of one member from the Knights of Pythias, one member from the Masons, and one person that was a member of both. So they contracted the thing, and then the two organizations paid rent to pay it off. And the contractor, I don't know if you can see that or not. It's Lambert Huber, contractor, and the architect on it was George Berensmeyer. He's a Quincy architect. And that's the other cornerstone. Says the same thing, except it's for the Knights of Pythias. And you can see on the front entrances, there's two main entrances. Above the door, way up, you'll see where one of them was KOP and the other was AM and whatever the other one is, Masons. Now, I imagine a few of you remember where the original Farmer State Bank was. At the time the fraternity hall was built, there was a person by the name of Isaac Cutter that was a member of the Masons, and he was the Grand Secretary for all the Masons in the state of Illinois. So he had all the records from all the Masons in the whole state, including dues and money and stuff like that. So he went to Lambert Huber, he needed office space for him to use as a Grand Secretary. So he built that Farmer State Bank building. It's on the corner of Jefferson and Ohio. Still there today. I think it's a thrift shop of some kind, or antique. But that was built in 1917. And about 1920, 1921, Isaac Cutter died. And somebody else from somewhere else became the Grand Secretary. But it was in 1921 that the Farmer State Bank was formed. So that Farmers Bank started in 1921, just at the same time that Isaac Cutter died. So they moved right in, had the safe and everything in there. So it was a bank ready to go. Okay, let's get into barns a little bit. Lambert built a few barns around different places. That particular one is out at Winsome Acres. It was built for a person by the name of Clarence Dickoot. I think that was his name. And that's what it looked like when it was built, and you can see it has C.A. Dickoot on there, and the date down below the windows, 1912. So that's pretty much the way it looked like then. This barn is back behind Wagner's Farm Market place. And it's directly behind where Tim Wagner's mother and dad lived. That was on a piece of property that my granddad DeWitt bought. And I'll show his house a little bit later that the Wagners live in now. was built in the early 1940s, which was the last project that Lambert Huber participated in before he died. And oddly enough, it was being done, one grandpa was doing it for another grandpa. Oh, one more barn that I don't have a picture of, couldn't find one anywhere, was, if anybody's knew where Melvin Cranberg lived, he had a barn there, and he told me that Lambert Huber built that barn. And at the time he told me that, I was in high school and helping him bale hay, and I was up in the top of the barn sweating and that kind of thing. So he says, enjoy it, your grandpa built this. Great. Okay, we're into houses now. This is the Henry House. It was built in the 1890s. It's on Ohio Street. I call it the Henry House because it was built for his Henry. And in 2005, the bicentennial, this sign was in the front yard. I think it's inside the house today, from what Fred said.
Mr. Sherman sitting out here.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Were you there in 2005?
Oh, yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you saved the sign then.
Yeah, the sign is still there.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, it was built in the 1890s. His Henry was with the People's Bank and founder of the Camp Point Library. And it's now owned by now owned by Ellen Sherman. And that was in 2005, and I think it still is. That house is across the street south from the funeral home. And I'm not sure who lives there, but it had a sign in the front yard in 2005. It was built in the 1900s by Lambert Huber or Wilkes Warren, probably both of them, for somebody, Greg Freeman. He also built where the funeral home is today. And there was a sign in that yard. Built in 1902 by Lambert Huber. For it's kind of weird. William Holland, was an engineer in South Africa, he commissioned this house done for his sister, which is a little unusual. That house, I call it the Brady House because in 2005, that's where Morris Brady lived. And during my young days, it was Kenny Lawless that run the Lawless grocery store that lived there. It was built in 1902. That sign was in the front yard. That house there, I don't recognize it. Does anybody here recognize that? Okay, I think Don Stable lives there now. She happened to be sitting there. That was built in 1895 for Arthur Gay. Arthur Gay was a cashier at the Camp Point Bank. Don Stabler is a descendant of Arthur Gay, so and this house has never been owned by anybody but a descendant of Arthur Gay. It's out on the end of Ohio Street. At the time I was growing up, Steve Hendricks lived there, and that's where the three kids, Donna, Denny, and Dick, lived, and it was a funeral home. It was Hendricks Funeral Home, built in the 1890s. Says by Lawrence McFarland, but it was built for Lawrence McFarland. Steve Hendricks had evidence that Lambert Huber had built it. Just across the street, I call it the Lawless House, but Dr. Kerr lives there now. But Charles Lawless and his wife lived there for many years, and that would be the father of the two Lawlesses. Well, there's three Lawlesses that together they owned the hardware store and the grocery store across the street from each other. The hardware store was where Bailey House is, partly. That's not Bailey House. They're not in that part. It's that agricultural insurance place was in there last. That is, I call that the Liggett House because it was built for Roy Liggett, who run and operated the Liggett Lumber Company. Built around 1910. Built for Roy Liggett. I'm calling that house the Cole House, but that's because Mike Cole lived there and did the renovating on it and brought it back to its original condition as much as possible. That's next door to the bed and breakfast Victorian Inn. And that's just another picture of the front showing how the porch and everything stands out. Did a beautiful job on it. That's the way it looked in the 1950s when I lived there. I lived there from 1947 to 1952. That was during a time when I had 3 half-sisters. So we had a bedroom for everybody. We sold it to a person by the name of Lyle Drake and his wife, and she made a nursing home out of it. She later sold it to, eventually, Winnie Jacobs bought it and operated a nursing home out of it. And for a time, it had outside stair steps going up to the 2nd floor to satisfy government requirements. That's an old original picture, and I give the original picture to Mike Cole while he was renovating. He did all the renovating on the inside first that was necessary because I guess he didn't want the tax people to drive by any sooner than they had to see how pretty it was. So he did the inside first and then he finished the outside. But he made it look pretty much like this picture. But that picture is pretty about the way it looked when it was built. That house was built for somebody in the family called Boger. In that 1999 book, it's got a picture of a grocery store, and it was owned by Fred Boger. And he also owned a grocery store in Golden at the time. So he had 2 grocery stores, and he had a family. And, they were kinda in business with him, so one of his sons, I believe, had this house built. He had a daughter that, grew up in that building, that house, and she married a guy by the name of Lyle Pabin in Quincy, and I got to be friends with her two sons, and she would come out and visit. Because next door to the north, there's a little house there, and at the time I lived in this house, there was a guy lived there named Art Boger, and it was his brother that had this house built. But he was a bachelor, I don't think he was ever married, but he, an old man just lived with his dog. And, being a little kid in the late 40s and early 50s, I liked to play with the dog. So I spent quite a bit of time with him. In fact, he even took me to Golden a time or two for lunch. And I suppose he did that because at one time they had the store in Golden. Don't know where it was or anything about it, but that's what it says in the 1899 souvenir book. And he built the Bauer Funeral Home. Jay Bauer's father told me that, and there's plenty of evidence looking at the work in here that he did build it. That is, I call it the Spence house because Aubrey Spence lived there many, many years. And I think the person that owns that now is here in the room somewhere. I see him raise his hand. But that's a photo that was taken and it was in the newspaper about the time they bought it, Glenn Tryon. And it had an article in there telling about it and the fact that Lambert Huber had built it. That's a house over on Illinois Street. And at the time I found out that Lambert had built that, there was a person living there by the name of Robin Cogshell. I don't know who lives there now.
He does.
Could be him.
Yeah, he still does.
Is he here?
Still lives there.
Oh, he does? Okay. Okay, that's Buddy and Sherry Renner's house. That was built in, 1891, I believe. Yeah, 1891. And they did major upgrading and repair on that house. That's what it looked like when they bought it. So they found, which was typical, when they were renovating inside of the wall, they found pieces of wood or something in there that described when it was built and who built it, and they just stuck the evidence in there. It's kind of like what's hidden in a cornerstone on something. But that happened in several occasions, as I've learned about Lambert Huber building something, because somebody that had bought the house had opened up a wall and there's a description of when it was built and who built it. So I've been accumulating information over quite a few years. That house is on the corner of Illinois Street and York. I call it a Ballbrock house because when I was young, Dick Ballbrock's uncle lived in it. Okay, that's the Wagner house that was built in the early 1940s for Marv DeWitt and his wife, my other grandfather. And an interesting thing about this, there used to be a Presbyterian church in town, and it was being torn down in the late 30s and I think early 40s. And my granddad DeWitt somehow acquired the lumber in it as they were tearing it down, and he would go out frequently in all his spare time and take the nails out of 2x4s and lumber and stuff like that. And he used much of this house come from that torn down Presbyterian church. But I remember going there because he lived there from, I'm not sure, 1943 to the late 40s. And I think he sold it to Speedish Camp, or somebody, Bill Speedish Camp maybe? And then Harold Harkness lived there for a while.
John Museum is who bought it in the late 40s.
John?
That's where they moved, couldn't, moved to remodel it. It is already remodeled.
Could be, I don't know. Anyway, if anybody in here finds out or knows anything about any of these houses or houses that I don't even have listed, I would like to know so I can keep accumulating information. So I kind of like history. That house is on the corner of the highway, and I think it's Iowa Street that goes by it, and that's where Charles Royalty lived, and most of the kids, like Brian, was raised there, built in 1911. This house is out in the country. That's where Jerry Herker and his wife lived, Marge. And he was doing a renovation around his front door about 4 or 5 years ago. And he found a newspaper and a rolled up piece of paper that he took out that give the date 1902. I've tried to make a copy of it, but it didn't reproduce very well. But it was built in 1902 by Lambert Huber, and it names 2 or 3 other guys here. And it had a dated newspaper and plus this thing rolled up, and it was above like the entrance door where he had rebuilt the transom or something up there. That house is across the street from the family house that he built in 1912 on York Street. It looks completely different now because it's been redone and everything, but his son, Charles Huber, that lived to age 32, lived there when his 2 children were born. That is where Dean Moore lives today. And that's where Marilyn lived for a long time. Donna.
And you used to work out in the sea.
I used to work there. I think you served me some dinners out there. Some lunchtime. That's the house behind the Shake Shack. And I don't have any information on it except my dad told me that Lambert Huber built it. And I just threw that in. If anybody in here has not seen a photo of or remember the stockyards in Camp Point, that's it.
We took hogs here as a kid.
Is that where Bostert's are now? Is that where Bostert's farm equipment is?
No,
No?
no,
Or is
that
that
is,
across
from Beckman's Tavern. Yeah, across from Beckman's.
Okay.
yeah, across from Beck.
I remember that, I saw hogs.
It runs from Illinois, north of the railroad tracks,
Yeah.
between Illinois Street and Kentucky, that whole block.
Okay.
That thing stretched out along the railroad track.
You'll get paid across the street, and in the back room, the cigar smoke, and it's called a hog parlor where they place cards at.
That was the office. Well, the front part of it was the office. And the back part of it had 2 card tables, or 2 or 3. And there was a
Do you know when it was?
pinochle game going in there all the time, and the smoke was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Spent tunes laying around.
You didn't tell them how it disappeared?
What?
When it was torn down?
The train yard.
63, I think, is what it says on the photo. But I'm not sure if the train didn't, the train that derailed might have taken care of some of it.
Oh. And then did he go out with Walden's then to the current stockyard then?
No.
No,
That was Marvin's brother.
Marvin's brother, yeah, Ed. But Ed, Marvin and his brother were in this hog business together. But then Ed left and went somewhere else. Is that right? Okay. Linda knows. It's her grandpa. But Marvin and Ed Hewitt had it from
26 to 61.
26 to 61. Right.
That's about right.
And the first house I lived in when I was born was right across the street from the hog office. So I had made quite a few trips to the hog office. That's on School Street, and it's the second house east of the funeral home. That's what it looks like today.
I don't know, that's what it looked like when I lived there. I used to live there, and that's what it looked like about 10 years ago, so. Yeah.
What, that?
That home, yeah. That I think is taken when I lived there, so.
That's what it looked like in 1947,
I think I have a picture.
because I lived next door and I took that picture, I think.
I think I might have a picture from earlier than that too, so.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're,
That's over on Vermont Street. About across the street from where Al Barner lived. That one's where Tim and Tracy Stabler live today. When I was growing up, it belonged to the Grosses. Gertie Gross, and it'd be Joanne McCoy's grandma. And she taught piano lessons. Everybody took piano lessons from her.
Took lessons there.
Yeah. That one I'm not sure of, but I think there's plenty of evidence around. That's where Bobby Balcom lives now. And it's for sale if somebody's interested. Got a sign in the front yard. Okay, we're done with houses that I'm aware of, anyway. And he, in his later years, after he got kind of old, he spent a lot of time in his shop. And he made furniture, made a lot of furniture. And this is just a few pieces that he made. And at the time he died, I remember going up to that shop with my dad, and he had patterns, all this different furniture, he had patterns cut out because he would make numerous copies of it for different people. People would see something that they liked and they'd say, oh, I'd like to have one of those. Well, he had the pattern saved for him. In the back of the building was a big elevator, it was like a freight elevator. And it was operated with ropes, because there's no electricity at the time, but it had pull rope, you pull yourself up or let yourself down, so. And there was a lot of house plans and building plans rolled up. There was a big drawing board right in the center of the second floor of that building, and it was surrounded by drawings in tubes. Oh. I wish I had them, but we burned them. That's another piece, that's a rocking chair. Actually, that's mine. And, that's mine too, it's right beside my bed. And that is I call it a pie chest. I don't know what it was originally used for, and somebody told me it was a pie chest, but you open those front doors on it, it's got a lot of small shelves in it. They're only maybe just a few inches apart. I guess maybe you store pies in there or something, I'm not sure, but it's solid walnut, like most of the other furniture. And it is situated in Huntsville, Alabama right now, in my son's bedroom. And that's also there. That is a bed that he made, it's solid walnut, turned on a lathe and everything. And that's a side table. The leaves flip up on it, make it bigger. And that is his final resting place, and that is an evergreen. And that's the Huber lot, and these smaller gravestones are the deceased children that he had, like the stillborn and ones that died of diphtheria and typhoid, whatever. And that's his marker. Lambert and Christina. And that is the end of the show.